The war in Ukraine has exacerbated a global food crisis. The United Nations says more than 800 million people go to bed hungry every night. A recent UN brokered deal with Russia and Ukraine to allow Ukrainian grain to leave the Black Sea, offering some relief. But the problem goes well beyond that. Nick Schifrin has more, with one of the administration's most senior officials who's trying to tackle a worldwide challenge.
The U.S. says 40 million people have become hungry since Russia invaded Ukraine. The war has combined with COVID, rising food prices, and the worst drought in 100 years in East Africa. A Senegalese minister recently warned more people could die from the food crisis than died from COVID. Among the most acutely affected, Afghanistan, where 20 million people, more than half the country, are experiencing high levels of acute food insecurity. Yemen, where 19 million are food insecure. And the Horn of Africa, where the UN says 37 million people suffer from acute hunger. That is where USAID Administrator Samantha Power recently visited to give a major speech about food insecurity, and she joins us here in the studio at NewsHour. Samantha Power, welcome back.
Good to be here.
To the NewsHour. Let's start in Ukraine. Ukraine and Russia, as we just said, there's a new deal to allow Ukraine to export once again. Ukraine and Russia combined make up a quarter of the world's wheat exports. How big of a difference will that new UN brokered deal make?
Well, already, even since the deal was brokered, you saw an impact on global wheat prices. I mean, that's, I think, how significant it can be, but that was on the basis of the aspiration for the deal to stick, for implementation to go forward, for the ships to start to move. We've seen one ship so far, as you know, 26,000 metric tons of corn on that ship heading to Lebanon, a place that is massively food insecure, a place that gets more than 80% of its wheat from Ukraine. So that's very significant. That's 26,000 metric tons that would not otherwise have gone to Lebanon if Putin had, stuck to the blockade in the way that he had been. But it's one ship. And Ukraine used to put into the global market before the war 6 million metric tons a month. So we have 26,000 metric tons, very important, can't discount every part of that, but it gives you a sense of what the throughput needs to become if you're going to get close to that 6 million metric tons and really start to see the impact on global food prices and the reach of Ukrainian sunflower oil, wheat, barley, and corn.
There are no U.S. sanctions on Russian exports of fertilizer or food, but there are U.S. sanctions on the transportation companies that would take that Russian grain out, insurance companies that would protect that grain, and the Russian banks into which people would pay for that grain. Do you acknowledge that, at least a little bit, U.S. sanctions have contributed to the increase in global food crisis?
What has caused the massive spike in food prices that we've seen since February 24th is Russia's invasion of Ukraine and this completely willful blockade. I mean, all that had to happen is actually a security guarantee for any ship that was flowing. Then you would have seen the insurance rates reflective of security guarantees. Instead, even in the wake of this deal, you see Russia actually bombarding Odessa, which then, of course, has a massive chilling effect on insurers. So I think that's really where the focus should be. In addition, you've seen the Russian foreign minister travel, for example, recently since my trip to sub-Saharan Africa. And it's just disappointing. There's an awful lot about who's to blame for global food prices, but not a lot, not any, in fact, that anybody can see, any assistance. It's words, misinformation, lies, but no actual support to countries like those in the Horn of Africa that are facing this incredible hour of need.
So let's move to East Africa. Some of the largest buyers of Ukrainian and Russian wheat are in East Africa, where, as we said, tens of millions of people currently suffering from various levels of hunger. Food prices have risen dramatically. There's historic drought. You went to Kenya and Somalia and announced $1.2 billion in assistance. In some ways, is that a drop in the bucket for what's needed?
Well, it's a lot of money, and it's going to buy a lot of food and a lot of assistance. Prior to the trip, I also announced an unprecedented investment in so-called RUTF, the therapeutic food feeding, the therapeutic food and pouches, packets for very, very malnourished, acutely malnourished, very small children under 5. And that's the largest investment in RUTF that has been made. But also, we're doing a fundraising drive to get others to match that.
Because others do have to.
And it is the rare form of food assistance where if young under 5 children don't receive these pouches, 90% of them will die if they're severely malnourished. But if they get those food pouches, 90% of them will survive. So for anybody who wants to contribute, UNICEF is managing this effort, and it's incredibly important. So this assistance is key. It's key in its own right, as I've said, but it's also key as a marker for other countries, because we need other countries to do, frankly, what they did the last time the Horn of Africa faced a less severe drought back in 2016, 2017, which is to step up. And right now, the United States is accounting for more than 80% of the World Food Program appeal. That's not sustainable. It's not sustainable to the taxpayer here. And we've had major bipartisan support for this effort to meet food needs. But it's also not sustainable because no one country can sustain funding for appeals that are going to be this significant. So the scene is grim, Nick, and we're seeing just the precursors to what lies ahead. So I met with pastoralists, who traditionally are herding their goats and their cows and even their camels, which are very resilient in tough climates. And many of them might have had 500 goats and cows or sheep, even 6 months ago, gone, not one. And so suddenly their livelihood is gone, but also their fallback, their emergency reserve, right, is the actual food itself, the animals themselves. And there's suicides among these individuals, but above all, there is severe hunger. And so we have to combine the emergency food assistance with the recognition that climate change isn't going anywhere. It's only going to get worse in terms of the shocks. So for individuals like that who are dependent on livestock getting access to feed, but also to water, there are going to have to be alternative pathways for them as well in the long term. And that's what USAID really specializes in, is food security, resilience in the long term. And there again, Congress has stepped up and given us more resources to invest in drought-resistant seeds, drip irrigation, the kinds of things that can withstand some of these conditions. But other countries just aren't in that effort in the way that we need them to be.
One country that is showing up, though, in Africa, as you mentioned, is Russia. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, just did a visit. The U.S. is the largest donor across the board when it comes to this stuff, but nearly half of the African countries voted not to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine earlier this year. Do you acknowledge, in some ways, your assistance doesn't match your influence?
Well, I think the U.S. has tremendous influence across sub-Saharan Africa, and I will say that because the U.S. is the country that shows up first, just a year plus ago with vaccines to help vaccinate those in sub-Saharan Africa who wish to be vaccinated, then so soon on the heels of providing, again, PPE, diagnostics, everything, and then the vaccines, so soon after that to be showing up in this way, leading the world in providing food security assistance to build resilience, and also the humanitarian emergency food and health aid. I mean, it is overwhelming, that show of leadership right now.
But Russia's, for example, offering a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. I mean, it says what it is. But.
Right. Where has Russia been for the nearly 80-year history of the United Nations in opposing Security Council reform? But putting that to one side, I think what is clear is that some of the voices that made the biggest difference in actually bringing about the UN and Turkish brokered deal to let the grains go, as we say, to end Putin's blockade and his, in a sense, war on food and war on the poor around the world, it was actually African voices, developing country voices that made a difference. So whatever they're doing in public, whatever their fears are about Russian retaliation, because there's a lot of intimidation that occurs when a UN vote is about to happen. There's also a lot of inducement and bribery that goes on. But in the end, those appeals behind the scenes, that pressure from those countries has gotten us to this point and needs to be sustained.
Can I just ask about Afghanistan? And unfortunately, I only have about 30 seconds, so just very quickly. Half the population experiencing acute food insecurity. WFP says that actually the number of donations is going down. The price of food is going up, to the point where only 8% of the country will soon receive food rations. Again, just 30 seconds, I'm sorry. Can the U.S. do more to help the people of Afghanistan?
Well, we're the largest humanitarian donor by far. Since the fall of Kabul, we've provided more than $500 million in assistance in Afghanistan, humanitarian assistance. This is another area where we need untraditional donors, for example, those from the Gulf and elsewhere who might have even ties with the Taliban regime, that of course we do not, to step up and to join us in providing assistance.
USAID Administrator Samantha Power, we got to end it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.